Let's get this thing started. So welcome to the second session of this conference, which is devoted to the viewpoint of architecture and urban planning. Let me perhaps briefly introduce myself. I am Sven Sterken, a professor in the history of architecture and urban planning at the Faculty of Architecture from KU Leuven. My research focuses on the built heritage of the later 20th century with a particular interest in religious buildings. And what brings me here as head of the session is that I've been involved in over 20 feasibility studies for adaptive reuse of parish churches in Flanders, Belgium. But before I go on, I think I need to place a few words of thanks to Kirsten, Johannes, and Paul. I have been first in touch with Kirsten about this event more than 3 years ago, which I think gives you an idea of how long preparations have taken to organize this conference, and also what an effort it has been from their part to put all this together. And I'm convinced that in these couple of days, we will not only learn a lot about the potential future of our churches, but also about how international conferences might take place in post-corona times. I'm going to share one slide just to illustrate what I want to say. I hope you can see it now. So as I said before, the theme of the session is the viewpoint of architecture and urban planning. And the fact that a church is a building in the first place seems so self-evident that it is in fact overlooked in much of the debate that often centers on stakeholder involvement, on the appropriateness of a new program, on heritage values in the cultural sense, and so forth. So we thus speak about the repurposing of churches as if behind the huge numbers that you will see in the presentations to come, behind the huge numbers, it is somehow a homogeneous category of buildings with uniform characteristics. But as you are all well aware, that is far from the case. And I've put up this slide here, which gathers a number of churches that I myself have been involved in over the past few years. And it will be discussed a bit more in detail in Charlotte's presentation. But this slide, I think, already shows that on such a tiny surface like Flanders, there is a huge variety to be found in terms of size, styles, and also location. So one question or statement that I hope that we can tackle in the discussion is the following. How does the diversity of the church as a building type affect its potential for adaptive reuse? Or put differently, how can architectural categories such as typology, style, or expression come into play when discussing about the future of our church buildings? In other words, this is a plea for a more nuanced understanding of church buildings in their material and architectural dimension. Because beyond the pragmatic and practical question of what these buildings can do, we should also perhaps ask ourselves what they can become. What can they become if we look deeper into their intrinsic material and spatial characteristics? So this is a question that I would like to discuss with the panelists, but everyone in the audience is of course free to interact through the chat with which Kirsten will follow up and which we hope then to include into the discussion afterwards. Okay, so finally, let me introduce the panel, which, true to the setup of the conference, is quite diverse. Diverse, I would say, in two respects. In the first place, it is a truly international panel, gathering speakers from 4 neighboring countries, namely Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and the UK. And although some American presidents have had difficulties distinguishing these countries from one another, it will become clear right away through the presentations that they present quite different approaches to the topic. And also interesting is the fact that the 4 speakers represent 4 different institutional backgrounds. We have somebody from academia, we have someone from the heritage sector, from the Foundation for Baukultur, which is, I think, an almost intranslatable term, and there is also someone who represents a religious body. And of course, all these actors look at church buildings from different perspectives, yet all seem to act from a shared concern, namely that of a sustainable future for our church buildings. So that is enough for my introduction. I'm now going to give the floor to the first speaker, which is Charlotte ARDUI. She's a PhD candidate from the Faculty of Architecture, and she works on a research project entitled Faith in the Periphery. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Sven, for this kind introduction. And I would first like to thank the organizers for this opportunity of speaking here today. I think it's a very welcome moment to disseminate our viewpoint and to position ourselves in the European discourse. In this presentation, I will first concisely sketch out the specific situation of reasoning churches in Flanders. And in the second part, I will discuss the project agency, Adaptive Reuse of Churches, which is a public initiative that deals with the issue. On the way, I will already point out a few leads to the rationale of my research project, which bears the same title as this presentation, which is Faith in the Periphery, Design Strategies for the Adaptive Reuse of Post-war Churches, and which is supervised by Professor Sven STERKEN, and which I will explain in more detail in the final part of this presentation. Okay, so let's get started. I first want to draw your attention to the fact that I'll be speaking about the Flemish discourse and not about the Belgian, for the obvious reason that the reuse of churches is a regional responsibility. So in Flanders, as you can see, we have almost 1,800 churches, of which almost half of them are listed. I think for most of you, that's not really out of the ordinary, but what is the fact that compared to our neighboring countries is that the issue of reusing churches became rather late on our agenda. In the last pie chart, you can see that's indeed still a, let's say, a marginal phenomenon. Since 2013, only 35 churches have been repurposed. And this low number ties in with the very particular situation in Flanders. First, it's important to bear in mind that Flanders is historically almost exclusively Roman Catholic, which means that there's no competition or comparison that speeded up the process. Second, the specific ownership of structure of our churches limits the urgency too. Basically, we could say that there's no clear separation between state and church. Still today, places for worship are to a large extent maintained with public money. And then roughly 10 years ago, the government took initiative by introducing two instruments. On the one hand, municipalities and local church boards were invited to develop church policy plans, which are long-term visions that indicate the future use of every parish church in the municipality. In those plans, 1/3 is appointed for new or shared use in the upcoming years. And because of this forecast, a second instrument was introduced, which is the project agency. And later this afternoon, Jan Jaspers in session 3, I guess, will discuss the first instrument, and we will go deeper into the second. I just want to make one final note on this slide, and that is, please have a look at the number of post-war churches. And what is remarkable is that in the church policy plans, these churches are almost always giving up for new or additional use. Okay, the project agency is an instrument that has been established to help stakeholders with the predictive wave of church closings. It aims at centralizing their expertise, and its goal is to stimulate qualitative research. In total, 7 parties has been involved, under which the Heritage Agency and the diocese, but more significantly is the fact that also the Flemish government architect is involved. It shows that from the beginning there's been an awareness that reusing churches is an architectural challenge too. Therefore, the project agency assigned 6 design teams based on ambition and portfolio and not on profit and name. But what does the project agency do in fact? Well, they offer so-called feasibility studies in which designers explore the capacity of a building and test the practical and financial viability of an envisaged program. And to go beyond the obvious, the designers work with scenarios that they present in 3 stakeholder meetings. When we zoom out and have a look at the impact of this instrument, we could say that although the follow-up is limited, I guess very few of the 115 feasibility studies has proceeded yet to an actual design project. This initiative has created an impressive momentum, and it's absolutely the merit of the project agency that in Flanders, reusing churches is perceived not just a management issue, but yeah, a premium creative challenge, let's say. So this slide gives an overview of the studies that have been developed by the consortium around Studio Thijs Vermeulen, Studio Roma, and Professor Sven Sterken. And I will use this slide to draw some substantive conclusions. First, in terms of use, we could see that the focus is mainly on public and communal use. I mean, daycare centers, libraries, community spaces are frequently recurring. Second, the spatial interventions range from very small interventions, gestures such as just adding curtains, to more radical transformation, for example, partial demolition. And a third finding is that giving up the church entirely as a place of worship remains delicate. In many cases, the commissioner opts for a smaller sized sacred space within the new profane church building. The project agency has also its limitations, and this is exactly the breeding ground, let's say, for my research project. In the first place, there is still a very functional approach. Most of the design research focuses indeed on accommodating a given program. Second, the designers tend to incorporate the public surroundings, but there's often only a commission for the interior, when often the real challenge is found beyond the physical boundaries of the church. And third, churches dating from the post-war period are manifestly underrepresented. And most of the expertise is indeed on the traditional basilica typology. But there is one example of a post-war church in the portfolio of this design team, which is the St. Joseph Church in Zonhoven, which is built in the 1970s and is located in a quite generic peripheral context. And the brief was to add community features such as a library, meeting space, and a music studio. The preferred scenario included 2 similar gestures. On the one hand, they added a U-shaped cabinet wall inside and also a similar shaped border outside that redefines the public space. Both interventions are quite low key, but they are very strategical because they generate a new dynamic. Yeah, a recurring theme is to incorporate indeed the public surroundings, but this ambition of scaling up, zooming out, runs against the limits of the project agency. We believe that a new dimension could be given if these projects would be anchored in bigger societal challenges. And that brings me to the rationale of my research projects. So just like the church in Zonhoven is is a textbook case of a church that has been built as part of the suburban expansions in the 60s and 70s. During that period, Flanders developed into a Nebular City. It became almost entirely urbanized, and a very important number of churches were built to serve that expansion. And today, these churches can be found at the intersection of three societal challenges. One, the effects of unconscious land use call for more sustainable vision for the urban sprawl in Flanders. Two, the post-war fabric is on the threshold too. It's usually less appreciated and it suffers often from material decay. We have no strategical assessment of post-war fabric yet. And thirdly, the most obvious in the context of declining church attendance, as mentioned earlier, one out of three churches will be closing in the next years. In my research project, I will use these post-war churches as a lens to investigate these concerns or challenges, because we believe that they might provide clues to investigate the future relevance of churches. And that brings me to my research question, which is quite a heavy question indeed, but if we break it up in a sub-question on what, why, and how we're going to work, it probably will become more comprehensible. So what are we going to do? Well, the project looks at modern churches as resources for future urban development. We will investigate how the adaptive reuse of church buildings can support the resilience of their context. Why are we going to do that? Well, we believe that churches are very valuable assets in this regard. They are strategically located and they represent iconic volumes. And how we will mainly rely on research by design to test which interventions are appropriate and to go beyond the economic and functional requirements. Well, the research is structured in 5 work packages. I will now only tell you something about work package 2 and 4. In work package 2, we will try to understand the characteristics of post-war churches and compare them in terms of siting, typology, materiality, and so on. Through mapping and measuring, we want to explore the intrinsic development potential. And in work package 4, then, we will test the theoretical premises developed in the previous work packages in a real world situation. We will conduct design experiments through drawing, model making, and so on 3 case studies. Maybe I want to highlight one more thing about the final outcome of this research. I think by way of conclusion, we are aiming at developing and maybe publishing a practical design manual. Okay, work package 2 and 4 comprise respectively a more quantitative and a qualitative focus. For work package 2, we are working with the 46 modern churches in the Diocese of Antwerp. And in work package 4, will evolve around 3 case studies that represent different urban contexts and a variation in church typology. At this moment, we have acknowledged 3 types of contexts and 3 main typologies. In both work packages, we are closely collaborating with students at the Faculty of Architecture. And we believe that's beneficial in 2 ways. On the one hand, for us, it's a direct way to test our hypothesis. But on the other hand, for students, it's also valuable that reusing churches is part of their curriculum. And this is work that has been developed by students from a research seminar. They analyzed the 46 churches in the Diocese of Antwerp. Students did archival research, they redrew the plans and so on, but simultaneously we also asked them to approach this corpus from one specific angle. And the poster on the left shows presents a comparison of the shape and the size of the bell towers. The students also included the density and the height of the surrounding houses with a view to critically assess the signposting function of those bell towers. And on the right, you see the work of students that compared the size of the church with the size of the parking areas, which is graphically translated into colored planes together with icons of every church. For instance, on the top left, you see that this particular church has a lot of square meters of waste space, let's say, and from one specific angle, this might show the physical development potential on the plot itself. And then since a few years, there's also a design studio that deals with the issue about reusing churches. And last year, the students made design proposals for several churches by architects Marek de Sauvage. Here you see the Verrijsningskerk, which was built in 1975. And before going on to the actual design project, I want to point out its significant location. On the one hand, in the west, east of the church, there is a nature reserve. And on the west, there's a quite dense garden city-like neighborhood. So the church is located at the very border of Leuven, a small village. So these are two projects that I want to present to you. Both projects started from the development potential of the wider context. The first project looked at the nature reserve and discovered that the entire neighborhood is found in flooding area. The students made a physical and functional connection with the nature reserve, and they implemented a visitor center with a new lookout tower. They designed, let's say, gradually degradation of the built environment and envisaged that nature eventually will take over. And then at the bottom, the other students did an opposite movement. They addressed the surrounding houses as their main starting points and anticipated on the aging of the residents. The students made a proposal for an entire reorganization of the neighborhood. Here you can see it, with new family houses and with communal gardens. And they reused the church as a kindergarten with community features. We have selected those two examples because we think that in line with our research objectives, they reveal already slightly that the reuse of churches can be indeed a vehicle for the sustainable redevelopment of a certain context. So, yeah, so far my presentation. To conclude, I want to make one final remark that's perhaps also an opening to the discussion. Although the project focuses on very specific corpus and starts from a very particular context, we believe that its outcomes will be relevant far beyond these particularities. And our aim is to develop design tactics that transcend these particularities and to explore to what extent they might, concepts might be generalized. So I'm looking forward to your questions in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Almost perfectly in time. Well done, thank you. So the concept of the sessions is that we have the presentations, in this case, the 4 presentations in a row, and afterwards we can have discussion, which then involves all 4 speakers and of course the audience, which is consisting of 313 participants at this moment. Okay, let's move on to the next speaker, who is Albert REINSTRA. Albert REINSTRA studied arts and architecture history at the University of Groningen. And since 1997, he works at the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands, first as a general building historian, and since 2008 as a specialist in church architecture. His presentation will be in English and it is entitled Church, Government and Citizens and the Reuse of Places of Worship.
Ladies and gentlemen, for a number of years now, the Netherlands has been working hard on the national program Future of Religious Heritage, led by the Cultural Heritage Agency, church communities, heritage organizations, local governments, museums, and other important stakeholders. They are actively involved in the sustainable preservation and realization of a new future for houses of worship. In order to gain insight into the extent of the problems with sacred buildings, research has been done on the facts and figures. All existing places of worship, such as churches, temples, mosques, and synagogues, built up until 2019, were mapped. This has resulted in a remarkable sample of religious buildings. You can find these on the National Heritage Agency's interactive website, Kirchenumnutzung. The data shows that of the more than 7,100 sacred buildings in the Netherlands, 75% are still in religious use, often with some form of secondary use that provides additional income. The remaining 25% of places of worship have been given a wide variety of new functions over time and still play an important role in our daily life because we live and we work there, we play sports there or go there for mental relaxation, we go there to the dentist or the pharmacy, or we bring our children there to play. Houses, health centers, trampoline halls, and a lot more. Anything seems possible. But why does there seem to be such a difference compared to other European countries? There are a range of reasons for this. And to get a better understanding of the Dutch situation, I will briefly mention a few of the important ones. Then I'll follow up with some of the dilemmas and point of attentions and challenges that play a role in the church, government, citizens triangle. Of the main causes for the many reused churches in the Netherlands, I'll begin with the secularization. The main reason that many churches have become available at the moment is due to the great diversity of denominations and religious movements in the Netherlands. In our small country, there are over 170 different religious denominations alone. Their building drive from the end of the 19th century until well into the 1960s resulted in a large and diverse building stock. When, in the 1970s, the number of traditional churchgoers and believers started to decline sharply, a surplus of buildings was created, only a small part of which was demolished. Secondly, the church-state and ecclesiastical policy. In the Netherlands, there has been a strict and clear separation between church and state since 1795. The government does not interfere in ecclesiastical matters, and the church takes care of its own personnel and buildings. Churches are owned by the local parishes or congregations. They have to take care of their property, and only if a church is listed as a national monument are there state grants available for restoration and maintenance. Demolishing listed churches is not allowed, hence selling for reuse is often the only option once these churches have been abandoned. The majority of believers in the Netherlands are Catholic or Protestant. Unlike the Catholics, the Protestant congregations are independent and have their own governing authority and can make their own decisions. For Protestants, the church isn't a consecrated sacred place, So selling the building for reuse is easier, but also painful, as you can see on the right. Third point, real estate developments. Decreasing numbers of church members, large buildings that require a lot of maintenance, and a few real estate assets lead to less income and financial troubles within the faith communities. Land and buildings, especially in the urban areas of the Netherlands, are scarce, making church buildings interesting objects for project developers. Due to the high value of the land, it can be a reason to dispose of buildings and sell them. The fourth reason, the general policy on heritage and buildings and the contemporary architectural vision. The reuse of religious buildings has a long tradition in the Netherlands. Just after the Reformation, various Catholic churches and monasteries were given a second life. And nowadays, preservation by development is the line that is followed by governments, project developers, and architects. Not only the object plays a role, but certainly also the location. In this area-oriented thinking, the church building is an important anchor point. Reuse can also be defined in spatial planning legislation. By means of a structural vision, the municipality can set down its vision on church buildings in the zoning plan. A zoning plan regulates the use of land and buildings. The permitted functions are laid down as well as what may and may not be built. The national government also promotes reuse by means of financial devices, for example, revolving funds and subsidies for feasibility studies into new functions for the churches. A final point that I would like to mention that certainly has an influence on the reuse of houses of worship is the Dutch culture of consultation, the so-called polder model, or consensus decision-making through dialogue and cooperation to achieve results. Decisions about church buildings are not made in a haste, and everyone, including non-churchgoers, such as local residents or heritage enthusiasts, are allowed to have an opinion about a church building in the Netherlands and have a say, one way or another, in any major change. This so-called visual ownership sometimes leads to difficult processes in which relationships can get strained. However, ultimately, it often leads to a supported compromise on a new function. These factors are therefore directional or decisive in the reuse of churches and preventing their demolition. For the many examples, it may seem that in the Netherlands everything goes smoothly and is possible, but not everything is allowed. There is a constant discussion about ownership, suitable functions, on the various values, and emotion often sets the tone. In the church, government, citizens triangle, everyone has their own dilemmas and challenges, or interests and problems. I would like to highlight a few things for each stakeholder. It starts with the owner, the church. When a decline in members and finances forces you to dispose a house of God, it leads to many emotions and discussions within the faith community. Sometimes the result is a great internal discord. For example, about the choice of the building and the future. Do we go for the money in a business-like way so that we continue for some time elsewhere? Or do we opt for a meaningful and sustainable transfer to a socially responsible party, but with less revenue? Internal consensus within a parish or church community about the future of the building is essential for the faith community and for the process afterwards. Church policy by the bishops and the Protestant General Synod on abandoned churches is constantly being adjusted. In order to prevent undesirable activities, restrictions are sometimes imposed on the buyer beforehand when a property is sold, via bid books with minimum selling prices and via clauses on sale with penalty clauses. Various functions are excluded and requirements are set for the use of the interior in the building. These preconditions and building stipulations seem to limit the possibilities of reuse considerably. Formally, little seems possible, but practice shows that more is possible than expected. Acceptance of a new function often depends on the way it is implanted and filled in, along with the intention and credibility of the initiators behind it. In the case of commercial functions, for example, a supermarket belonging to a large chain is perceived differently from a market hall with small entrepreneurs selling their local products. The offer is the same, but the form and the feeling is different. If we look at the national and local government involvement, we can see that the greatest interests, tasks, and dilemmas probably lie in the area of heritage, urban planning, and the sometimes inflexible laws and regulations. How quickly can you switch legally and from a planning point of view when an interesting opportunity arises? And how do you maintain sometimes very special interior features? Combinations of movable and immovable heritage that tell the story of the religious community, liturgy and rituals on the one hand, but also that of local or sometimes even national history on the other. In 2016, the Heritage Agency and Museum Catharijneconvent Utrecht together made a book about 100 very rare church interiors that are still in use. Now, 5 years later, of those 100, a number of churches have already been abandoned and the interior values are being wrestled with. This Lutheran church is one example, a richly decorated building, exemplary of the Lutheran Netherlands, but now unused and sold by the congregation to an investment company. The latter wants to realize a hotel there, resulting in a great loss of interior. And the neighborhood is in revolt. And so we come to the citizens. For despite the fact that local residents are often no longer part of the church community, they continue to concern themselves with the church building. Local residents tend to take action when they are confronted with the consequences of church decisions. Whether a seller or buyer looking for understanding and support, they must be sure to promptly inform and communicate with the neighborhood. New destinations bring with them new dynamics and energy. Matters such as traffic flow, parking problems, or noise pollution affect the neighborhood. Most are readily accepted if there is opportunity to participate, and especially if a function is envisaged that contributes to a local community. A healthcare center in the church will simply cause fewer issues than a commercial function for an initiator who develops plans that mainly contribute to his own financial gain. The local government plays an important role in bringing together the needs of the neighborhood, the emotions and the interests. If this happens to a lesser extent, or if it is left to the entrepreneur himself, This can considerably slow down processes and lead to negative attention. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would say that things are tough in the Netherlands and the number of empty buildings will rise sharply. However, the general awareness that a place of worship is a special building that can be given a beautiful and fitting second life has grown. Practical examples have shown that informing each other about the state of affairs in a careful and timely manner is crucial. Good consultation between the parties before and during the process of transforming a church is the key to success. Dialogue is the best guarantee for a good result. A shared vision in which choices are made for preservation, reallocation, and possibly demolition is inevitable. Integral church visions can be the key to this. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Albert, for this very nuanced insights in the Dutch situation, who I think to many of us has always appeared as the guiding country in these matters. But as you explained, reality is far more nuanced than what we might think looking at it from abroad. So thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to the next speaker, who is REINER Nagel. REINER Nagel is a trained architect, and after a career in the Berlin Senate Department for Urban Development, he's now the chairman of the Federal Foundation for Building Culture, Stiftung Baukultur. And he also lectures at TU Berlin in the field of urban design. His presentation will be in German, if I understood it right, and is entitled Kirchenumnutzungen aus dem Blickwinkel der Baukultur. In English, this would translate as repurposing churches from the perspective of Baukultur. Reiner, please.
Yes, thank you, Sven. Yes, you're right. Baukultur can't be translated. We just worked as a Davos declaration towards a high quality.
So what do citizens think of Baukultur, building culture? First of all, these are aesthetics, architectural shapes, but it's also urban planning and spatial planning. So this is about listed building, monument protection, but we think Baukultur is much more. And we can see that we have a number of ecological aspects and how we can anchor this from a social point of view, and also about what is the impact of room of space on people, and also the process quality and the immaterial cultural reality of our society. This is also one aspect of Baukultur, and we have also heard about it today. So Baukultur, what do we need? We need planning, we need building. This is what architects know, but we also need development and operation. So here we look at the left-hand side of the staircase, we can see the development of ideas and the operation of buildings, phase 10 and phase 10. And this is quite important to today's topic when it comes to the reuse of church buildings. And in order to have positive processes, future-oriented processes, we need a pre-phase with ideas. And of course, we also need kind of trial stages in order to present ideas that can be planned later on. And of course, many church buildings can look back to long history because there are many different ways. The foundation of churches are part of where cities and villages were founded. And in Germany, we have 11,400 parishes, and 900 parishes have a historical center, because usually the church is at the center of cities and towns. Next, of course, to town halls. This dimension of building is very important, because especially in smaller towns, churches are usually the only reference to Baukultur. This is usually where people think, oh, this is how you use bricks, how you use ornaments. And this is really a reference for a whole generation. And this is where people can find out what kind of material is used. This is used as a reference project for the whole community. And so it is very important that architecture and Baukunst of these buildings also expresses a certain spiritual identity. So we have, of course, antiquity, the idea of what church actually means. Then we have the Romanesque period, then the Gothic period, then Renaissance, Baroque, and of course modern times, modernity. And this, of course, is the idea of reflection, the church representing a place of reflection. This is what we can find. And we have to be aware of the fact that it's not by coincidence that if you look at the European build, you can see buildings representing certain epochs. First of all, you have certain eras, and you can see bridges. It is very important in order to represent the impact of Baukultur, of churches. Here we have 3% of our buildings that are monuments, 30% are buildings that should be maintained, and then we have 59 buildings that are everyday buildings. But when it comes to churches, these are most important buildings. In Germany, we can have 80% of our church buildings are listed buildings. But there are many churches that are listed buildings. Protestant churches, 20,500, Catholic churches, 24,000. So this means more than 80% of our churches are listed buildings. That's why they are particularly important when it comes to heritage. And it also applies to post-war churches built after the Second World War, because they also find their expression in sacred buildings. And here we are at a critical stage. We really need to realize these are important characteristics. So we have about 1 million cultural monuments, and about 1/3, and this also applies to churches, are endangered. And 75% of the people, they are proud of churches, architectural buildings, and they think that this is really part of their pride. Because what are we going to show to visitors? Of course, we show them nice buildings, historical buildings. This represents the pride of citizens. We have a new Baukultur report dealing with public space, and we would like to find out more about interior space and how important it is to the public. We are not only talking about parks and streets and roads, but also the interior. And we try to find a systematic overview. On the one hand, we have traffic space, which means schools or stations, but also sacred buildings like churches that are hybrid public space. Well, if we look at the Cologne Cathedral, we can see that there's a lot of public space. We have a station, we have squares, and of course the church rooms as such. And this is a phenomenon that was drawn in the Nolli plan of Rome. And here we can see the church buildings and interior space and yards that can also be used by the public. And this term of public space is also something that applies to churches, because we have responsibility not only as far as sacred buildings is concerned, also profane buildings. Here can we see the Nolli principle applied to the city center of Cologne. Churches, of course, a place of community, and of course they also shape our cities and towns. And when it comes to redundant churches, well, they're leaving behind a void. And we will hear more about it when talking about post-war churches. 25% will become redundant, and that's why the seminar is dealing with reusing possibilities. And of course, church buildings will also be sold, and many of them were already demolished. And 272, for example, was sold by the Protestant Church. And this phenomenon that these buildings are really in danger particularly applies to rural areas. Here you can see this donut effect, because the church is right at the center. And if these churches are missing, it will have an effect on the identity of this place. So usually people think we have to develop the church, we have to sell the church, but I think this is really dangerous. I wouldn't sell any church building, because you need to have in mind all these towns and cities that sold flats and residential buildings in the past, and now they would like to get these residentials back. So you may offer lease contracts, but I would definitely not sell them. The churches should keep them. Churches are a special place of identification. 26% of citizens in Germany have been committed to maintaining churches, because 3 or 4 years ago in Bochum there was a special Baukultur workshop at the Anneliese Brost Forum, and we used this church as a cultural place. But in our Baukultur report, the penultimate report, we also had a survey asking people what kind of reuse would be appropriate according to you. And here you can see the outcome. Concerts, exhibitions, library, cultural use is accepted among 90%, or social use is also accepted. For example, kindergartens, but restaurants or other places of worship or residential buildings is less than 50%, but other ideas, for example, for leisure, sports or retail, is only accepted by 20%. But this is actually what happens quite often. Usually it's gyms or it's a place for doing sports, but this is not what the population actually wants. And here we have it's usually associations that try to launch initiatives here. And here we can see a pictogram, an organizational chart showing that these 3 partners, politics, church, economics, and businesses, they need to interact in order to find out how to proceed. We need associations, we need the members of church councils. They are quite autonomous when it comes to their church, and they need to develop a project. And of course, we also need investors and planners, but this is where the initiative needs to come from. Of course, it's not only about COVID, pandemics, but we also need to take into account climate change, resources. And if we think about urban mining, churches are buildings with a lot of building material, and they need to have a future as well. If you look at the building stock of Germany, we see 360 tons per inhabitant in Germany as part of, this is like an ICE full with people. So this is really a responsibility that we need to assume, and that's why these topics relating to a recycling economy are very important. This is even more important after COVID-19. We just cannot demolish them. We need to turn them into something else. We need to take our building stock into the future. So it is not by coincidence that reuse, which was considered not to be sexy, is now considered to be something very positive. The award awarded by the public was actually, was awarded to a reusing project. And we also need to look at the different associations and cultural associations that launch initiatives here, and we have more of them in the rural area than in cities and towns. 20% of cultural clubs and associations focus on listed buildings and monument protection. This is mainly the case in rural areas. Here we have 42% in the rural area, and here we can see that there are many people supporting us, and we need to work with these stakeholders. They are supporting us. So we need to promote Baukultur. It needs to become a part of our education. We need to teach this at school. In the Netherlands, I think this is much more common than in Germany. So we ask our network, what can we do in order to promote education, Baukultur education? What is it? Is it about lobbyism? Is it networking? And 51% said you need to start at school. And the German Foundation for Monument Protection, Deutsche Stiftung Denkmalschutz, tries to go to schools to teach this subject, even if it's not a church topic. You can also consider it to be a secular topic because you need to promote expertise and knowledge about it. So this was my input on Baukultur in Germany. So churches are places of building culture and Baukund. It's not only about the church, it's really the responsibility of the society. So we really need to bring this together, buildings and churches. And of course, that it's a place of meeting, because this is the main objective of the churches. They need to stay sacred spaces, and because denominations are growing, not in Germany, but in other places. In the Czech Republic, for example, hybrid sacred or post-sacred use is also a possibility. So reversibility and flexibility should be used as a design principle. And then there will be a number of layers that can be used that will help us to develop a new language of design, of architecture. I think we have only just started to think about the reuse. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Reiner, for this almost all-encompassing presentation. I can see from the questions and the remarks in the chat that it has risen a lot of interest. So we'll come back to it, certainly. But first, we'll listen to our last speaker in this session, Joseph Elders. Joseph is an archaeologist and architectural historian, specializing in churches, heritage management, digital recording, and conservation theory. And since 2019, he's the head of Church Building Strategy, Cathedral and Church Buildings Division for the Church of England. It's also interesting to know that previously Joseph has worked in Germany and also in a lot of other places, amongst which Abu Dhabi in the Emirates. So he brings with him quite a diverse background. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Also vielen Dank für die Einladung, für die Verantwortlichen beim Volkswagen in Hannover, und ich werde jetzt Englisch sprechen ab jetzt. So my title is Rethinking England's Churches as Public Assets, and I just want to emphasize I am only speaking for the Church of England today, not other denominations or faith groups in England, and talking about parish churches, so the church for every parish in our country. So I would just say before moving on to the next slide, that if you go to England, if you're ever allowed again after COVID, you will not see a church that looks like this. But I hope that it does give you an impression of what I'm going to talk about today, which is about not necessarily reuse of churches, but the mixed use of churches. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Church of England and our church buildings, what and where are they? So we have 16,000 churches, approximately. And in 1968, we had 18,000. So we have lost 2,000. Most of these were closed in the 70s and 80s. And since then, not so many. An important fact here is that 10,000 of our churches, 60%, are in rural locations. So they are in villages, not in towns. And that serves just 17% of the population. Now, that is important. England is a very urban country, but our churches are, in many people's eyes, in the wrong places. So how old are they? This is important because the nature of the estate determines our actions. So 50% are medieval, so pre-Reformation. 10% 17th and 18th. 30% are 19th century, what we call Victorian. And 10%, only 10% are 20th century. And Sven, in terms of the theme you have chosen, in England, it is a problem that these 20th century churches are not generally repurposed. If they fall out of church use, they are not demolished, mainly because of the poor quality of their build, with a few high quality exceptions. Next, please. So there is agreement between the church and the state. Church of England is state church, that churches are underused potential assets. So over 25% of our churches now have as little as 20 regular worshippers. Some rural churches having 10 or fewer. Everyone has said this, and they may be used only once a month for a few hours, which is not useful use of a building. And this can lead to unsustainability, and the reasons are clear. High maintenance and other costs, particularly conservation costs, because so many of our buildings are old, and this is carried by few shoulders. There are diminishing sources of funding. With COVID, I will say more about COVID later, the funding landscape has changed. There is a lack of resource for income generation. So if you have older people looking after a church, they may not have the skills. Next slide, please. So what's happening to them? I said many churches closed in the 70s and 80s, but at the moment, only 20 close each year. That is 0.12%. It's nothing. But COVID and the consequences of COVID may lead to a dramatic increase. We will see. Most of these churches which close are not rural village churches. They are actually 19th or 20th century suburban churches. So typically in big cities, in areas where the demography has changed. So it may be quite different people living in an area, a suburban area of a big industrial town than previously lived there, with a different religion in many cases. Our strategy for sustainability is to support multiple users and uses. So we call this complementary use, not alternative use, although alternative uses do happen. I think my colleague, Peter Ayres from the Churches Conservation Trust will say more about this. So those uses, we divide them into three: community, cultural, or commercial. Often there is all three, 2 or 3 of these uses. Next slide, please. Why should we try and keep so many local parish churches? One reason: communities in England have lost many local assets, local community assets, such as pubs, which is terrible, banks, social and youth centres, and shops. And this has been accelerated, made much worse by COVID. So the parish church is often the last remaining public building and focus of community life and memory. People may have nowhere else to go. And during the COVID pandemic, this became very clear when churches were closed. Next slide, please. So here is a list we've heard from other people of our, we call it the 3 C's, community, commercial, and cultural uses. So quickly: village shops, farmers markets, food banks, homeless shelters, local businesses, Wi-Fi and telecoms hubs, particularly good where we have many tall towers, cafes, mental health or drug dependency centers. This is very much needed now in COVID. Doctors, surgeries, dentists, practices, post offices. Many local post offices have closed. Art and music groups, nurseries, creches, and community groups. Next slide, please. So our strategy is to redefine our mission by rethinking the roles of our church buildings. And to support this, we have created a range of strategic options in addition to parish churches. So we do not want to have 16,000 churches that are all the same. So we have festival church, so the Christian festivals, but also local festivals, perhaps less formal services in a church. And we think this could be up to 5,000 of our churches. We have major churches, which is a group of 300 churches. This is extra to cathedrals, which are often tourist attractions, the most important building in their town. And we have resource churches, which we heard about fresh expressions this morning. So this is one kind of fresh expressions, a new congregation in an old building, which is usually urban. And there are about 100 of these. Next slide, please. So festival churches, this is a new idea. So the church is shared with the community, perhaps less formal religious services, more community use. And this, as I said, could become 1 in 3 of our 16,000 parish churches. This map is from our church heritage record. So you can see these 2 churches on the right and left have almost no homes or buildings nearby. The one on the left is the Churches Conservation Trust building. So again, Peter Ayres, my colleague, the Churches Conservation Trust looks after the best of our churches which have to close. Next slide, please. So at the other end, we have major churches like Shakespeare's church, Stratford-upon-Avon, Holy Trinity. Shakespeare is buried there, and for that reason, this church normally gets 200,000 visitors a year. Of course, with COVID, nothing like this, and that is a real financial problem this year for our churches who rely on what people pay when they come through the doors. Next slide, please. Here you have a resource church, and this is a new congregation. So this is in Brighton on the south coast of England, and we have a new congregation in this building, which is now 1,000 people, and rising. And you can see they are actually all facing to the north in this picture, not towards where the altar would traditionally be in the east. So this is a very flexible use of this building. They have cleared out all the pews. All the church seating has been removed so that this building can be used flexibly and in a new way, but by the Church of England. And the Church of England has put a lot of money into this kind of work. And Fresh Expressions is more flexible. This is the Big Bang version. Next slide, please. So the title of our strategy here is Open and Sustainable Churches. So flexible church buildings fit for the future. You can see in the picture here, there is a shop at the west end of the church, but it's still a church. Next slide, please. Converting a church building for several uses can be very complicated. Many of our churches are protected listed buildings, 85% of them. So we have provided guidance to communities on how to do this. It's called Crossing the Threshold. It can be found on the web. And that is a step-by-step guide to developing a place of worship for wider community use and how to manage a successful building project. So the information is there on how to do it, and many, many churches have gone down this road, have tried to do this. Next slide, please. So some examples: post offices on the left, in the middle, a farmer's market, on the right, a village shop. All these things are happening within churches still in use for worship. Next slide, please. And here is one example of a church which has been imaginatively partly repurposed. So all three, commercial, community, and cultural uses. In Michael House in Cambridge, this is in the middle of the historic centre of Cambridge. This church was not used for anything for many years. It had been a bookshop, that was not successful. It had been a community space, that was not successful. But now it has a cafe, and this was very controversial, very difficult when it was done 20 years ago. Now, seen as normal. So you can see in the left, you can see the cafe. Up in a gallery, you have more cafe space. On the right, you can see the chapel, which is still used for worship. And this is a very high quality space. But even that space is used for conferences and for other purposes. Next slide, please. This one is an extreme example. It is still a church. It is still very much a church, but it has this pod built into it, which is for the community to use. It has meetings, they have dance classes, all sorts of things. I think the important point here is that this church has a bigger congregation, more people worshipping, and more people using the building than it had before this pod was put inside the church. So it's not just that you have to find a new use. The new use can help with the original use, make the church more attractive, more popular, and this is a way to engage with more people. Next slide, please. Now, we're talking about architecture. Sven mentioned talking about the architecture of our churches, but I would like to say one more thing. Churches are not a cube of architecture within a void. They sit within a setting, and that can be the most important thing, how they sit in their village, how they sit in their town. So we have got a database of all our churches. This is new. We didn't have this 5 years ago. On the left, you see the two provinces of the Church of England. blue is Canterbury, red is York. In the middle, you can see every one of our 16,000 churches. So where there are no churches, that's a mountain or some other natural feature. So that is actually a very good tool to talk to government. We cover the whole of England. There is nowhere except a mountain without a church. On the right, you can see Yorkshire, the northeast of England. You can see all the burial grounds. So we have recorded every single burial ground as a shapefile, and we are recording them in detail. Next slide, please. So part of the attraction for many people of their church is the churchyard, its setting in its place. So here we can see this is German technology, German backpack full of lasers and cameras, and the churchyard is being recorded. A typical churchyard can be recorded in less than 2 hours in this way. And we have now started a program of recording. Now we know where they are. We are recording all our burial grounds in detail. Next, please. Via our website, Church Heritage Record. Next, please. And this allows also for churches and cemetery managers to actually manage these spaces. And it also means we can record everything within that space, including trees, wildlife, Fledermäuse, bats. Next slide, please. And of course, one can use drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, which are being used a lot to spot high-level problems and to create 3D models of these assets. Of course, one problem there is you cannot see under the trees, as you can see, which is why we do the survey of the churchyards from the ground with the rucksack. Next slide, please. So this allows us to record absolutely everything that we have using our churches and churchyards, not just people, but biodiversity, wildlife. Church of England churchyards protect hundreds of endangered species. Sometimes they are the last place you can find certain species. It is really, really important to protect these spaces, and the best way to protect them is to keep them in their use. So I'm coming to the end now. Next slide, please. So I haven't included any URLs or links to websites because they're always changing. But everything I have talked about can be reached through the Church of England website. If you Google Church of England, church buildings, you will find what we do. And if anybody has any interest in talking to me about any of this, that is my email address. I'm sure we can link up through the talks and chat. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks, Sven.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joseph. I think the idea of being able to combine the three C's in the example that you showed, the Michael House Center, that's quite inspiring to see that community, culture, and commerce can go together. That's an inspiring example. Thank you so much. So we've now had the 4 presentations. We have like, let's say 25 minutes for discussion. A lot has been said during these 4 presentations, so everything that I'm now going to try to summarize will be disrespectful, but let me try. I think there's 2 key elements that have come forward through these 4 presentations, I think, and the one is numbers. We've seen numbers of churches in the thousands. I was astonished to hear REINER say that there's 40,000 churches in Germany. That is an incredible amount. And like Joseph mentioned, the use of new technology makes this even more daunting in the sense that we now have access to this database. We have access to the, let's say, the buildings in their numerical substance, but that makes, I think, the task even more challenging because we now know that they're there. I know, for example, in Flanders that only approximately 10 years ago, for the first time, a survey was made of how many parish churches do we have and what is happening in them? So all this knowledge is very fresh, very new, but I think makes the challenge even more daunting. And in relation to this, and this also came up in the session this morning, I think, is that now that we are looking into these churches and asking ourselves, okay, what is happening in them or what could happen in them in the future, has also a sort of mirroring effect, because it somehow shows what society is asking and what is lacking in society, what needs are arising through looking to these buildings. Maybe picking up one element that REINER mentioned is also the notion of public space. I think it's a very fundamental debate that we have to conduct, perhaps not now, but I think in this context, what do we understand under the notion of public? This morning there was a whole debate on the notion of the sacred, but I think the same can be said for the notion of public. What is public space in the 21st century? And is a church a public space? Yes or no? These are, I think are very fundamental discussions. But as I said at the start of the session, I want to somehow reframe it and stick to the architectural viewpoints. And I think in relation to that, perhaps two elements have come to the fore across the four presentations, I think. And the one is location, of course. That location is a fundamental aspect of any church building. And most of these buildings are indeed strategically located in the rural areas, as we've seen in Joseph's presentation, perhaps most of all the same in REINER's presentation. We saw that in these German villages, the church is like the fundamental building that defines its core. The same in the urban environments. Even in the big cities, I think the image of the Conner Dome next to the train station was quite revealing, in the sense that you have these two big bodies that somehow can interact or act with one another. And then in Charlotte's presentation, we saw these typically in-between condition that also has become, I think, very typical for Europe anywhere. Yeah, these areas that are neither urban, neither rural, but somehow sit in between, but also feature a lot of churches. And I think a second fundamental aspect of this architectural characteristic is age. I think the age of the building is a very fundamental parameter in our discussion. And I have this impression, and I think it's somehow corroborated by what has been said throughout the session, is that the younger a church building is, the more vulnerable it becomes. The more vulnerable in the sense that it has been said by someone, I don't remember, I think it was Joseph, yeah, you said that the more recent buildings are generally torn down because they are of poor quality. I think that is indeed one aspect. Many of these buildings were built with quite recent technology that had not been perhaps experienced or tested enough to be put into practice in these buildings. But I think another element is also that the younger a building is, the less it is rooted in memory. And we're talking about memory when we're talking about heritage, of course. So that is perhaps a sort of open question to the four of you. Would you agree with what I've just said, that the age of the building next to its location is like perhaps the fundamental architectural parameter beyond elements of style or size or anything else? Maybe who wants to go first? Joseph? Oh, yeah, Albert.
Yeah, we see it in the Netherlands also. The youngest buildings are demolished first, and that's why we, as a heritage agency, we had a project looking at the newest buildings, and all those buildings are not listed, so and the values aren't recognized, aren't seen. So that's why we had a project. Mapping those churches and look at it and make a first selection.
We have done a similar thing because we became quite concerned about the number of 20th century, especially late 20th century churches which were being demolished. So we had a conference last year on this subject to look at which ones are most significant. So we've been working with Historic England, trying to identify those ones which should be protected. But even with the ones which should be protected because they are high design quality, the materials are so bad and the environmental issues with them that it makes it very, very difficult. But we haven't really lost too many very valuable 20th century churches. Most of the ones which have been demolished have been not great. So in that extent, it's not such a problem. But we think it is a problem which could happen in the future. We are looking at it.
Mm-hmm. But I think that the very fact that the building is in poor shape, I think it also pertains to many historic buildings. But then we go at great lengths to restore them, to keep them. So why wouldn't we do the same effort for these more recent buildings?
We found with some of you would have to rebuild them completely to the same design with new materials. Yeah.
Maybe there's also a question for Reiner, because in Germany, of course, there's a lot of these post-war buildings. Can you add something to this?
Yes, I think on the one hand, it's a problem of seeing these old buildings. We know by surveys that most of the people like older buildings more than the younger ones. So we have to recognize them first, and we will recognize them in 10, 15, 20 years. So the children don't see the quality, only the uncles see the qualities. And the second hand is a high range of technique inside the building. So an old building has something like a big weight, which carries it temperature and technique and so on in the future. And the new one, which we need to energy efficiency reasons, by heating, by technology, by noise and so on, they need a lot of technique, and technique is not only a thing of costs, it's also a thing of, strength. And so there's often problems by the technique.
I would like to repeat this in Germany. It's especially due to the facilities, the technology that is used in these buildings. Sometimes it's too much to ask of these villages to try and restructure them for the purpose of higher energy efficiency. Well, if you have older buildings, you can just add these new technological structures, and usually they are more appreciated by the population. And so actually you can do more with these older buildings.
But Reiner, you also spoke about education, which is, I think, a fundamental part of this Baukultur in Germany. Wouldn't you think that also perhaps this appreciation for the buildings needs to be somehow, well, shaped? That this, well, people, if I may say so, perhaps need to become more educated about these buildings, what they stand for and what they potentially can offer for the future.
Yes, definitely, this is true. We need to tell our pupils more about Baukultur, architecture, building culture, and it should also be a subject taught by the churches. You can only see what you know. This is what Goethe once said. So you need to know who worked here, who was the architect, what kind of material was used, why did we use these regional materials, what is the history, what's the story of this building. And if you know more about the building, then of course you will help and promote appreciation.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, Heidi. Thank you.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah, I mean, we put a lot of emphasis. We call it the USP, so unique selling point, which sounds very commercial, but actually finding that is important. And a lot of the funding in England for historic buildings in the last 10, 15 years has been through lottery, the lotto, through the heritage lottery. And to get their money, you have to prove that you are interesting more people in heritage, which is right. It is right that they have that. Yeah, and that has been really, really good. And it does mean, I think, that people appreciate their heritage more, and that also church communities are making more effort to explain what is important and what is interesting about their place of worship.
Yeah, I think, well, that's at least something that Charlotte and myself found when doing research on these, well, the 1960s or even 70s churches, is that, okay, they're not part of this big history with a big age, but they play a significant role in the local history, because in many cases, the people themselves or their parents were involved in either financing or sometimes even building these churches. They would spend their weekends digging foundations to build that very church. So that's a part of history that's well, does not exist. It's not written, but it exists in the people's minds. And I think it's for us as researchers an important part to undig and tell these stories. Charlotte, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to make that point as well. I think the fact that those pastoral churches are so young, that gives also another dimension. Indeed, the fact that neighbors remember that when the church was built and so on.
Okay.
I would like to mention a project in the Netherlands from the Catharijnen Convent Museum. They have a project, and it's called the biggest museum in the Netherlands. And then they have about 20, 30 churches, and in those churches, volunteers are getting educated to tell school children about the building, and to learn what you can see there, and what's it isn't logical anymore for children. They don't know what they see anymore, so you have to tell them, and volunteers are getting educated by the museum consulent, and also we have the trust like CCT in the Netherlands. It's called our Groninger, our Friese Kerken, and they have also projects for children, for school children, and in their local church, they were told about the history of what you can see there, about the gravestones, all those things. So
okay, good. Well, that's interesting. Thank you. Maybe it's time to check the chat. Kerstin, can you give us an update on what questions have been posed?
I'm happy to do this. Well, actually, there's quite a lot to say. Some parallel discussions are even going on, and I can't repeat all of it, but there are loads of questions to our speakers. So it might be a good idea if you have a look later on. There's some individual questions. What is Baukultur, building culture in English? But sometimes there are also some statements. But I will try to give you an overview. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all of them. Matthias Ludwig says, well, the Flemish idea is quite interesting because there is this region, the contact and involvement of the congregation and the municipality. This is quite interesting, and it would be a good thing for Germany too. Well, I will leave out some of the comments. Then there is Ralf Philipp Stern saying, and he says it might be better to socialize these buildings instead of privatizing these buildings, giving it back to the public. So this means thinking about the medieval age. And Philipp Stern says the time to take a decision needs to be sufficient. This is really of the essence. People do not take enough time to take these decisions. This is typical of German. People are really rushing into decisions. This is not a good thing. And then we have one of our observers, and she says these are quite interesting processes, and they will take a lot of time because sometimes church buildings, they need to be repaired. And how can you combine these two lines? So she also focuses on time, on the topic of time. And then there's one last comment. What kind of category is this supposed to be? Sustainable, useful? Is God useful? Can we really use these categories to capture the holy, the sacred? And then there is another comment saying, Sabine Baumgart says hybrid and flexible use for the neighborhood can be the future, and the church as a public space should be maintained in the interest of the public. So I hope this is sufficient for the last 5 minutes of our discussion.
Perhaps if I may, I think I think these are all very useful comments that we could go on for, I think, another 2 hours. But maybe just to conclude, I think the aspect of time is perhaps an interesting element, in the sense that what we experience, at least in Flanders, is that, as Charlotte has pointed out, before 10 years, nobody was doing anything about these churches, and all of a sudden it's become like one of the topics in the architecture community. So on the one hand, that's positive because a lot of expertise is being generated, but on the other hand, there's this feeling that something must be done now. And so we also, I think we do run the risk indeed of going too fast, of doing things that we think now today are relevant, but perhaps might seem to become totally irrelevant in 10 years time. And that's perhaps one question I would ask to the various presenters, if you could just briefly reflect upon this aspect of time as a conclusion. Maybe Albert, could you go first?
Can you probably? I have to think about this question.
Well, first goes to Charlotte, perhaps a very spontaneous reaction.
Yeah, I think indeed it's a very important thing to keep in mind, and what we see with the work of our students, that sometimes it's better to, instead of designing a very fixed project, it's more interesting to design a trajectory or different scenarios that could that could happen.
Maybe I can add a few words here. On the one hand, what we should avoid is, because we're talking about, well, the property of churches, it's like gold, and it should not be considered as in terms of the building sector or real estate sector, because this will lead to mistakes. So this is not what we should do. When it comes to old church buildings, let's say there is a regular use once a year or every other year. This is also regular use. And if you have this building and just leave it, well, nothing will happen. This is not a problem for churches. So we shouldn't rush into taking decisions. So we have some hyper-active church officials. They need a new, a new building, a new structure, a new roof, and they should take a step back and think about sustainability. This is really important, and not just earning money.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
But when you don't have the money.
Yes, you do it without money.
Maybe Joseph, could you add something here?
Oh, well, the money is a big issue now. I mean, we haven't talked much about COVID-19 and the pandemic and the effect this is going to have on our urban landscapes in particular. It's different in every country, I know, but obviously local communities who are looking after churches have taken a huge hit. Everyone's taken a huge, huge hit. And we think there's going to be a new system coming out of the future, and we have to think about that and how churches fit within that. It may be that more churches close or they find a different use, maybe. We don't see that as advantageous. But we also see that society is changing so fast. And I think there was a comment in one of the chats that people with home working are now staying in their own areas. We found that very strongly. Actually, some churches have become a focus again for the community where they never went near it. And they're going there now because they're suddenly not traveling 50 miles to go to work with the high-speed train. They are staying at home, and I'm going to work from home from now on. I'm not going to the office much in the future. Everything is changing, and it is a massive challenge for everybody involved in heritage, and particularly with churches, to think about this stuff, how quickly things are changing now.
Yeah, yeah. And then it is architecture, which is a slow discipline, really has to adapt to that as well. Yeah. So thank you very much, Albert, Joseph, Reiner, and Charlotte. I think this was a very interesting conversation. Only, let's say, the beginning of a conversation, which is, of course, far wider than what we could cover in this 1 hour and a half.